In December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and its military alliance vanished. But NATO did not just survive, it expanded. This was not random. It was a chain reaction. So how did a verbal promise leave Russia feeling trapped by the very alliance meant to stand down? The turning point is not where most people think. By the end, you will understand how a single diplomatic assurance unraveled into what Moscow now calls strategic encirclement. The Soviet Union's collapse in December 1991 swept away not only a superpower, but the entire architecture that had defined Europe's security for nearly half a century. 15 new countries appeared almost overnight. The Warsaw Pact, once the Soviet answer to NATO, dissolved into history. In Moscow, the future looked uncertain. Russian leaders, still reeling from the speed of change, watched as former Soviet republics and Eastern Bloc states scrambled to secure their independence. For many, the question was simple: who would guarantee their safety now? In the capitals of Central and Eastern Europe, memories of Soviet tanks and forced allegiance were still fresh. With the old order gone, countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states began looking westward, seeking protection from any possible return of Russian dominance. At the same time, Russia's own sense of security was shaken. The buffer zone that had shielded its heartland since World War II vanished almost overnight. For Russian military planners, the loss of strategic depth felt like standing exposed on an open plain. Amid this uncertainty, a single phrase from the previous year's German reunification talks took on a life of its own: the words "not 1 inch eastward." In February 1990, United States Secretary of State James Baker told Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand its jurisdiction 1 inch to the east if Germany unified. The phrase was echoed in diplomatic cables and press briefings, but it never appeared in any treaty. Western officials later insisted the assurance applied only to the territory of the former East Germany, not to the rest of Eastern Europe. Russian leaders, however, heard it as a broader promise, a political commitment that NATO would not move closer to their borders. This ambiguity planted the seeds of mistrust. As the West debated the limits of its assurances, Russian officials and commentators began to argue that the spirit, if not the letter, of the not 1 inch pledge had been broken. Kremlin analysts warned that without a binding commitment, any NATO movement eastward would be seen as a direct threat. Levada Center polls from late 1991 show only 14% of Russians held a favorable view of NATO, a number that would only drop further as the decade unfolded. The power vacuum left by the Soviet collapse was not just about lost territory. It was about the collapse of predictable rules, the sudden uncertainty over who belonged to which camp, and the fear that old rivals might soon become new neighbors. As Russia looked for a place in the new European order, the question of NATO's intentions and the meaning of a single diplomatic phrase would haunt every move. For leaders in Warsaw, Budapest, and Prague, the idea of NATO membership was more than a diplomatic milestone. It was a shield against the uncertainty of the post-Soviet era. Memories of uprisings crushed by Soviet tanks in 1956 and 1968 lingered in the halls of government. Eastern European officials argued that only a binding collective defense, NATO's Article 5, could guarantee their sovereignty against any future pressure from Moscow. Public opinion polls in Poland and Hungary showed support for joining NATO at over 70%. Meanwhile, Russian policymakers watched these moves with growing alarm. In Moscow, Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov warned that the expansion threatened decades of European security arrangements. The sense of a broken promise, rooted in the 1990 debates over German reunification, became a common refrain in Russian political circles. On March 12, 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic formally joined NATO. Their flags were raised at the alliance's headquarters in Brussels. For the new members, this was a return to the West and a guarantee that the Red Army would never again cross their borders uninvited. For Russian analysts, it was the moment when an alliance designed to contain the Soviet Union now stood on the doorstep of the Russian heartland. Kremlin statements described the move as a dangerous precedent, warning that the alliance's logic had shifted from rhetoric to action. Just days after the first enlargement, NATO launched its air campaign against Yugoslavia. Operation Allied Force began on March 24, 1999, with waves of airstrikes over Kosovo and Serbia. The campaign, which lasted 78 days, was justified by Western leaders as a humanitarian response to ethnic cleansing. But the operation went ahead without United Nations Security Council approval, a move Moscow condemned as illegal and destabilizing. Russian Foreign Ministry officials called it a violation of international law, and state media warned that NATO was now willing to use force in Europe without consensus. The image of Western bombers over Belgrade played on Russian television, fueling public outrage and deepening the sense of betrayal. Polls in Russia showed NATO's favorability dropping to single digits. For many in Moscow, the Kosovo campaign confirmed their worst fears about the new security order. It was no longer just about words or treaties, it was about the alliance's ability and willingness to act without Russian input. The combination of new members and a first-ever combat operation outside NATO's traditional area left Russian officials convinced that the alliance was not simply expanding, but transforming. The sense of strategic vulnerability was no longer theoretical. For Russian planners, the question became not if NATO would move closer, but how far and how fast. NATO's second wave of enlargement arrived in March 2004. 7 countries joined at once, but for Russian leaders 3 names stood out: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These Baltic states, once Soviet republics, now raised NATO flags just a few hundred kilometers from St. Petersburg. The old buffer zone had vanished. For the first time since World War II, a Western military alliance shared a direct land border with Russia. In Moscow, the geography was impossible to ignore. Russian defense officials warned that air bases, radar sites, and missile defenses could now be installed within striking distance of key cities and military assets. The sense of exposure ran deep, shaped by centuries of invasions from the West, Napoleon in 1812, Hitler in 1941. Russian military doctrine had long relied on strategic depth, using space as a shield. The 2004 enlargement collapsed that space almost overnight. The anxiety wasn't just about maps. Russian strategic culture views the loss of a buffer as a threat to national survival. Kremlin statements describe the new NATO border as a direct challenge to Russia's security interests. President Vladimir Putin made the case publicly in his 2007 Munich speech, calling NATO's expansion a serious mistake. He argued that the alliance's growth was a provocation that undermined the balance of power in Europe and ignored Russia's concerns. The tension escalated again in April 2008 when NATO's Bucharest summit produced a new declaration. Georgia and Ukraine, 2 former Soviet republics, will become members of NATO. No date was set, but the language was clear. Russian officials labeled this a red line. The prospect of NATO's open-door policy, reaching deeper into the former Soviet space, set off alarm bells in Moscow, fueling a cycle of warnings, protests, and military planning that would soon have real-world consequences. Mass protests swept across Georgia in 2003 and Ukraine in 2004. In Tbilisi, demonstrators carrying roses forced out Eduard Shevardnadze, replacing him with Mikhail Saakashvili, who promised closer ties to the West. In Kyiv, the Orange Revolution overturned a disputed election, bringing Viktor Yushchenko to power on a wave of pro-European sentiment. Russian officials described both uprisings as Western-backed campaigns to pull former Soviet republics into NATO's orbit. Kremlin statements warned that these so-called color revolutions threatened Russia's influence in its own neighborhood. The pattern repeated a decade later. In 2014, after months of street protests in Kyiv toppled Ukraine's president, Russian troops moved into Crimea. On March 16, 2014, a hastily organized referendum claimed 96.77% support for joining Russia, with an official turnout over 83%. Most Western governments dismissed the vote as illegitimate, pointing to the presence of Russian forces and the lack of international observers. For Moscow, annexing Crimea was justified as protecting the Black Sea Fleet and Russian-speaking residents. For NATO, it was a breach of international law and a warning that old security assumptions no longer applied. The crisis triggered a new military standoff. In 2017, NATO deployed 4 multinational battle groups, each about 1,000 troops, across Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. The United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, and the United States led these forward units, rotating soldiers and equipment to reassure Eastern members. Russia answered by reinforcing its Western military district and deploying Iskander missiles and S-400 air defenses to Kaliningrad. Each side called its moves defensive. Each saw the other's posture as a threat. The result is a spiral, action and reaction, with troops and missiles ever closer to the borders. Neither side claims to be the aggressor, but the security dilemma grows sharper with every new deployment. Today, NATO's borders sit just a few hundred miles from Moscow. Each new deployment or exercise reignites old fears on both sides. As long as security is defined by threat, the spiral continues. The real risk now isn't just military, it's misunderstanding. Thanks for watching.